Now that we've talked about multiplying binomials, I want to look at going the other way, taking a polynomial and writing it as a product, this idea of factoring. The most basic type of factoring we have is factoring by a common factor. We want to look at our polynomial and see if all the terms have anything in common and pull it out. As an example, if we have something like 4x cubed minus 8x, we can see that the 4 and the 8 have a 4 in common, since 8 is 4 times 2. In addition, they both have at least one x. As I factor it out, I'm pulling out the 4 and one of the x's, so I'm left with 2 x's. When I remove the 4, I'm left with 2, since 4 times 2 is 8, and I remove the x as well. So this would be our factored form here. And we can double check it. 4x times x squared, well, that's 4x cubed. And 4x times minus 2, well, that's minus 8x. So we did get back to where we started. Now let's look at this one here. 9x squared y to the 4th minus 6x cubed y cubed plus 3x to the 4th y. If I just think of the numbers, 9, 6, and 3, we know that 3 divides evenly into all of them. However, the variables, the x and the y, might be a little bit harder. And essentially what we're looking for is the smallest exponent on each of these. My exponents on the x's are 2, 3, and 4. So I want the smallest of those, which would be 2. When I consider the y's, my exponents on the y's are 4, 3, and this one here is a 1, so the smallest value there is a 1, so I'll just write that as y. We know that 3 times 3 is 9. I've removed 2 of the x's and 1 of the y's, so I'm left with 3 of the y's. 3 times negative 2 is negative 6. I removed 2 of the x's and 1 y, so I have xy squared. Here I removed the 3, 2 of the x's and the y, so I'm left with x squared. And once again, you can FOIL this out and make sure you get back to where you started. My next example here, 3x minus 2 times x plus 5 minus 6 times x plus 5, looks a lot different. However, we can see that these both have an x plus 5 in them. So we're going to factor out the x plus 5. When I do, I'm left with 3x minus 2 minus 6. And then we can simplify that. We get x plus 5, and then that would be multiplied by 3x minus 4. So now we have our factored form. And while this seems like a really strange thing to do, it does help us with our next type of factoring, which is factoring by grouping. Factoring by grouping is a method for polynomials with 4 terms. The idea is that we're going to pair the terms. We're going to look at the first 2 terms, then we're going to look at the last 2 terms, and we factor each of those by grouping. So let's do some examples. The next problem I want to look at, x cubed minus 3x squared plus 4x minus 12. We do see that we have 4 terms here, so we're going to factor by grouping. Our first step is to group them in pairs. So we have the first 2 and the last 2. The first 2, we can see they have an x squared in common. And when I remove the x squared from x cubed, I remove 2 of the x's, so I'm left with 1x. And here I remove the 2 x's, so I'm left with a 3. My next 2 terms, we can see they have a 4 in common. When I remove the 4 from the first term, I get an x. And from this last term, I'm left with negative 3, since 4 times negative 3 is negative 12. And now that I've done that, I can see that once again they have this common term here, x minus 3. And when I remove that, I'm left with x squared plus 4. So now I have my factored form. We now have x cubed minus 2x squared minus 3x plus 6. When I group my first 2 terms together, they have an x squared in common. I'm left with an x for the first term and a minus 2 for the second. When I look at my next pair, we're actually going to remove a minus 3. So the 3 that the 3 and 6 have common, and then the minus because this first term here is minus. The fact that the first term is negative means we're going to remove a negative. If the first term was positive, we would have removed a positive 3. When I remove the negative 3, I'm left with an x. And when I remove a negative 3 from 6, I'm left with negative 2. And once again, this is because if we go the other way, negative 3 times negative 2 would be the positive 6 that we need. And once we've done that, we can see that they share this common x minus 2. So I can factor out the x minus 2. I'm left with x squared minus 3. And now we have the full factored form.